Hello and welcome to the Unlocking Behavior Change podcast, the show all about psychology and changing behavior. My name is Jamie West and I'm joined by Professor Robert West. Hello, Robert.
Hello, Jamie. How are you?
I am doing very well. I'm hot. It is extremely hot. My room is 29 degrees.
29 degrees. In Fahrenheit, that would be freezing, but I guess you're using SI units.
You're correct in that I'm using the one where 29 is hot. And how are you? I hear you've been to the tennis.
Of course, this is recorded. And yesterday I was at the Queen's tennis tournament, the last 16, watching Alcaraz, amongst others. And I think I'm pretty confident it's the most I've sweated in my entire life.
You're just baking. When I watch it on television, you're just sitting there. You are in an oven, effectively.
Definitely, and there was almost no breeze at all. There was a point in the game which was quite amusing because maybe about 2:30, something like that, where the tiniest of tiny little clouds came across and partially obscured the sun, and there was a collective sort of sigh from the audience, and the players looked up and said, "What's going on?" As though something important had happened. And all that, it was just the tiniest little cloud that went across the sun, and we all thought, "Oh, thank goodness for that."
The relief of it, I can imagine. My goodness. And I bet when people are listening to this, we'll probably be putting it out around the time that Wimbledon is on. So there'll be more tennis, and Alcaraz will probably be playing phenomenally well. Yeah. I saw him actually a couple of years ago because he won the last 2 years, and he just stands so far back from the baseline. When I play tennis, I couldn't even go that far back. I wouldn't know what to do back there. I'd get lost.
It's almost back in the crowd. I think that it does make such a difference. Obviously, when the ball is coming at you very fast, it just gives you that extra split second. But then you have to be able to move forward very quickly after you hit your shot, especially if they're going to be volleying or hitting a drop shot or whatever. But the power and skill level of these players is just extraordinary, and their stamina. The quality is just off the scale. It's so good to watch.
It's staggering. And of course, tennis players have to make decisions very quickly. That's a segue. You see what I'm doing here?
I think I do. This wasn't even rehearsed.
Not even rehearsed. Can you imagine? This first season is all about decision making. And we've been looking at the FACET framework, which we've discussed a bit already. So you can go back and listen to the other episodes if you want to, but you can probably pick it up from here. So FACET is a framework to help us make sense of decision making. And it stands for framing, assessing, comparing, enacting, and time or timing. Sometimes I'm not sure whether to put the ing at the end of them.
I think the time is not an ing.
It's just time the end of it.
It is the thing that sort of permeates the whole process, that you can't understand decision-making sensibly without incorporating the time dimension, which we will get to in 2 episodes' time.
We certainly will. And today we're going to be focusing on comparing. So last time we looked at assessing. Now we're into comparing. And am I right in thinking that the way we assess options is we're often comparing and assessing at the same time, aren't we?
Yes, we are. And so when thinking about the FACET framework, we're not necessarily thinking about a fixed order in which we do things, although you could do it like that. You could frame your decision, you could do your assessment of the options, then you could say, right, with all that information we've got, how do the options compare with each other? And then you go, woohoo, I've made my choice. Now I'm going to go and enact and evaluate. Obviously, in the real world, that isn't usually how it's done. You can mix these processes up, and you can go backwards and forwards in them, and people very often do, even in the most structured decision problems. So quite often, for example, when you're assessing things, you're comparing as you go along. Let's say, for example, that you're trying to decide on this is not a million miles away from something I'm involved in, trying to decide on a logo for a new organization. Now, you could get all your logos, your candidate logos there and do your various assessments. And then at the end of that process, you can go, right, now we're going to go through a process of making a comparison and seeing which one of them we like. But actually, it's often more efficient to do it in a very sequential way, where you take a possible logo, you think, okay, well, that's quite good, but it's not really, there's some things I don't really like about it or whatever. So you take another one and you say, which of these two do I prefer? And so you take the one you prefer. Now you've discarded the other one. Then you get another one and you assess that and you say, which of these do I prefer? And so essentially you go sequentially through them with your most preferred option at each point. So assess and compare are going sort of hand in hand through that process. So that's an example of how the assessing and comparing process in terms of the sequence of events can vary.
And it makes me think of the opticians, where they say better with or without.
Exactly. That is, in fact, a better example.
So there are lots of different ways that we can compare options. One of them actually, it's not quite the same, but you can shortlist. That's what I'm getting at. That's the words I'm trying to say.
Yes.
You can shortlist options.
Yeah, that's right. So obviously, in a lot of decisions, there's a lot of options to choose from, and you can't go through all the options in all the detail that you would like to in order to be able to make a very thorough and comprehensive evaluation and then arrive at a particular decision. So what we do, whether it's candidates for a job or whether it's research grants, for example, or contracts, a lot of the big decisions where there's a lot of potential options coming in, we go through a process of a sort of a first stage evaluation, and then that is kind of a decision in which we end up with fewer than we started with. And there may be a fixed number. So you say, I'm going to go from however many I start with to a short list of 5 or 4 or whatever. That's one way that you can shortlist. Another way that people can shortlist is to say, I've got a set of essential criteria that these options have to meet. I'm going to shortlist on the basis of those essential criteria, and that will give me a list. I don't know how long it'll be, but that'll give me a list of ones that I can then look at in more detail to focus on how good they are on those criteria and on a set of desirable criteria. So that classic sort of essential desirable thing comes in. So those are 2 ways in which formally in our professional lives we can do that job. And although we don't do it often that thoroughly or systematically in our personal decisions, we probably should. We should probably do it more systematically than we do. So, for example, when we're looking at holidays or cars or whatever, I know some people do. They'll say, right, well, I've narrowed the choice down to 3 or whatever, and now I'm going to look at those ones. But very often, we just do it in a much more informal and haphazard way, which can mean, the risks are that if you don't do it in a systematic way, then you end up excluding things or not even bothering to ever really look at things that actually might end up as your best choice. And you end up, maybe making a decision that is suboptimal.
It's an interesting point, isn't it? How much time we spend comparing and how detailed we are in our assessment of the options, our comparison, how deep do we go? I'm somebody who spends probably too long looking through options of things to buy and what should I get? I'm not sure. And I have to frequently remind myself. Once I learned about the satisficing rule, which is try and find something that's good enough and then stop looking. So I try and put that into practice where I can. But I suppose it's like anything. There's a scale. There are people who don't do it quite enough. Some people like me who probably analyze the decisions to death, and you just sort of think, oh God, each time is just a nightmare. So you think, oh, I just can't even be bothered. And then you just give up and walk away. You know, who needs to watch something on Netflix anyway?
Yeah, that's true. Well, sometimes you get paralyzed and you just don't make a decision at all, which we're going to come into, because not making a decision is making a decision, even though it doesn't feel like it. And so we'll come on to that when
why don't we get right? Why don't we talk about that? Because it is a big, we don't have to.
Okay, Fred.
I think that it's really important, actually, and easily overlooked or easily seen as being a much poorer decision is to make no decision, or to take no action might be a way to put it. But a lot of times I would argue taking no action is exactly what you should be doing. There are lots of times in a heat of a moment, or you feel your emotions are telling you that you must respond to this text message or this email that you've got that's irritated you. And you think, I've got to respond, I've got to do something. And actually taking no action might even be a viable, full stop. You may pause, or it might just be, actually, you just don't even need to reply to this thing that's bothered you. So, I think the no action is extremely powerful, and especially in a world where people get very heated very quickly on social media and lots of other places, and our leaders and politicians who are often pressured into action. But, people have to take action so quickly. And you think, God, it would be good if the media didn't pressure people into making terrible, rash decisions.
Yeah, rash decisions, knee-jerk reactions, that kind of thing are quite commonplace. And it would be interesting to analyze, even if it's an answerable question, I don't know, but analyze to what extent when we're making decisions, we go too far on average in one direction or the other. Are we too inclined to act rationally with knee-jerk reactions, or are we too inclined to overthink things and essentially paralyze ourselves with indecision because of all the different factors that you might need to take into consideration to be sure that you're doing the right thing? If I had to guess, I would say it's probably the former. I think we probably act on average too hastily, and we curtail our decision making too much. But there's definitely going to be cases that go the other way as well. So I think the key message around it is to recognize that how much resource and effort to put into this whole process is itself a decision, that you can never escape from making a decision, and that not making a decision is a decision. And so there simply is no way around it. You've got to face up to whatever it is that you're doing, and not doing something is also an action in a way. And what that means then, given that there literally is no escape from this, that you might as well do it as well as you can, given the constraints. And we're going to come on to this, where time comes into the equation. So you want, essentially, think of it like doing an exam. You want to use up as much of the time as you need to on a particular part of the exam, without going so far that it means you've got no margin of error at the end. You don't have time to look through the exam paper. You don't have time to check the things that the answers that you've given, or come up with something that you hadn't thought of. So that whole time dimension is incredibly important. But you're looking for that sweet spot where you're putting the maximum reasonable time, resource, and effort that you can afford to into a decision.
Okay, so let's say we've got a situation where, I don't know, we're interviewing for a job post. And let's say that we have a reasonable amount of time. It's not, years, it's probably going to be a month or something like that. So that's not unusual, is it? About a month.
Mm.
And so what advice can we give to people who they've said, right, I totally get where you're coming from. I need to put some proper resources into this. In that sort of example, what sort of processes are people going through to compare the options?
So most likely for most jobs these days, there will be far more candidates than you can evaluate fully. And so you want to use the time to the maximal efficiency. And so the kind of shortlisting process that has been recommended, and I think a version of this works pretty well, is what's known as the elimination by aspects, which is essentially if you find an option that has some attribute which is basically a drop-dead attribute, it doesn't matter what else they've got going for them.
And by option, you mean a person in this example?
In this case, a person. And I don't mean literally drop dead. But you've got all right, let's take a job interview or a job selection process. You've got a person, and there's just one thing that you've identified from their CV, from their application, it doesn't matter what, whatever bit of information might have come your way, that means that it doesn't matter what the rest of their features are, how brilliant they are, they're not going to be suitable. They don't fit an essential criterion. That's it. Stop. That's the end of it. And then you move on. And so that way, you're not evaluating more than you need to. And when it comes to the ultimate comparison process, you've narrowed down the options to things that are all potential runners. They're all candidates. It's that in theory, they could, at least from the information you've evaluated, they could be viable options. That is an efficient way of doing it. It's known as the elimination by aspects. People can look it up on Google, but it's a pretty well-known way of doing it, and it has been found to be pretty efficient.
So that is kind of a time saver. And I guess what I was thinking when you were saying that was the obvious things that you may eliminate someone for, saying they don't have a relevant educational qualification. That might be something, but then of course you may decide actually that isn't the most important thing, that they've got this particular qualification. There might be something else that you think actually they've just got to have great people skills. This is a role where they've got to have experience dealing with people. The qualification doesn't matter so much, but this is a front-facing role. And so there's many different aspects you might pick from.
There are, yeah, absolutely. There's many different aspects. Also, you draw attention to something about real world decision making that we're focusing on, which is that in the real world, you may go through that process and you've just knocked everybody out. and then you have to go back and think, well, do I re-advertise the job, which has costs and so on associated with it? In other words, do I collect another lot of options to think about it more generally? Or have I been a bit, let's say, strict in some of these criteria, and ones, and that there are people who, okay, it's not great, but I have eliminated people who, in the circumstances, might actually be okay and satisfy the needs of the job, or could be trained to. So you're now getting into that real world area where it's not fixed options necessarily or fixed features. These are potentially movable. So this person, okay, they don't have the experience, but they do have potential. And maybe what we can do is to give them a bit of extra training or whatever. Or in an uncertain world, if you're looking at someone's CV, you may think they don't look as though they've got the whatever capabilities are needed. But you don't know for sure. Maybe they just didn't put it across very well on the CV, or you're not interpreting it right. So there's areas for uncertainty. So what that means is you can go back if you need to and assess some of these features that you had thought of as drop dead features, but actually, in the circumstances, you can be a bit more relaxed.
Right. And I suppose with something like a job, there are different ways that you are narrowing down the options. At the beginning, it's usually just someone's CV and maybe a cover letter. And even before that, you may actually just go through a recruitment a service. So that may have already narrowed it down quite a bit. But then, of course, comes the interview. And I'm thinking, I'm a good judge of character. I can tell whether someone's going to be a right fit for me. And so I'm thinking the best thing to do is just to base as much as possible on the interview from that point.
And you would be very much in line with most people who do recruiting, and you would be wrong. And the evidence on this is just overwhelming. And it's so hard to pay attention to the evidence on this process. And it's so hard that, on incredibly important personnel decisions, and this actually goes for other kinds of decisions as well, we just find ourselves beguiled by this face-to-face contact that we have with someone. And in really, really professional, really good behavioral science-informed decision processes, they very often don't have an interview because they recognize the biases and imprecision and inaccuracy and weirdness of
they don't have an interview. Sorry, what?
Yeah, they don't even have an interview, which seems bizarre thing to do. How could you possibly appoint someone, let's say, to a MSc course or a PhD or a job without interviewing them? But if you've set up the process in a very clear, structured way with evidence-based criteria and proper, systematic, and effective ways of judging people on those criteria, then although it feels wrong and it's a more accurate way of making your selection. But what normally happens is that you use the sort of the paperwork, the people's CVs, their track record, and so on, as the basis for getting them into the interview, and then everything is done on the interview. Again, not a good idea. Not a good idea. Even if you're going to have an interview, the interview should be used to do the kind of thing that interviews can do. And what they can do is give you a sense of how good people are at interacting in that scenario. If that isn't if that's a requirement for your job, that's fine, do that. But don't use the interview to assess their capabilities for things that that you should be finding out from their track record, from exercises that they might have done for you. It's often a very good idea to get people to have a go at some of the things that they're going to be asked to do rather than use an interview to do it. And, I don't know, I know I'm banging on about this, but it is so common and it is such a waste of everyone's time, worse than a waste of time, for people to use interviews for things that interviews can't be used for.
So if I was going to push back against that, I would say people often say that you need to have a good culture fit because you're going to be working together in teams. And it seems to me hard that you could tell if someone would be a good culture fit without an interview.
You'd think. But people don't behave normally in interviews. If you're going to check whether someone's going to be a good culture fit, have some interaction with them which would genuinely assess whether they're a good culture fit. And, that might be getting them to come along to a workshop or getting them to have maybe a more informal conversation or come and meet the team that kind of thing. You're going to be doing this ideally, if you're going to do it at all, at the end of a process in which you've already established one or more people who you think could be pretty good for the job. And in a sense, you're using this to check that they will fit in with the team and so on. But an interview, I've had experience of this, and I'm sure people listening to this will have had experience, where you're interviewing someone who you actually know really well, and you wouldn't recognize them because they're not themselves. People get nervous in interviews. And if they don't get nervous, that's a sign. That's something you often forget about. That the people who do really well in interviews, because they're not at all nervous, you've got to think, actually, that's a bit of a warning sign. If they're not nervous in the interview, why aren't they nervous? Because most people are.
Are you suggesting they're some kind of psychopath?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that. But that level of confidence in that kind of situation is another bit of information. It's a signal, but it's a signal that has to be paid attention to. And I have had this experience of in interviews where someone I didn't know, they've interviewed fantastically, and I've just been like so thrilled at what a great conversation we've had in the interview. And then we have appointed that person, and it's been a disaster because, in a sense, the reason why they were so good in the interview was they had characteristics that did not make them suitable for the job that we wanted them to do.
You mean that there was something about what made them good at interviewing that made them less good at the job itself?
Like on the, they're great dinner party companions, or great in a conversation exploring the meaning of life, or the pros and cons of prime theory or combi model or whatever. But they aren't someone who is going to be necessarily reflective and careful and worried in a positive sense, or anxious that the kind of work that they're doing, the everyday work that needs to be done in science, is being done right.
I see what you're saying. And I suppose, correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm hearing is that what you really want to test for when you're trying to find anyone for a job, you want to get them doing the kind of tasks and roles that they will be doing in the actual job as close as you possibly can, and then make your judgment based on that.
And on their track record, what they've
done in the past.
The past predicts the future. That's one of the big lessons of psychology. The past predicts the future. So if you can get systematic information, but also, and I mention the word systematic here deliberately because it goes back to everything we've been talking about up till now in terms of the framing and assessing, but also the comparing, is that you do a much better job when you do it systematically than when you do it in a haphazard way. And mostly, even when we got really important decisions to make, we do it in a at least partially haphazard way. We don't go through things systematically to make sure objectively that we've covered all the bases, that we've boxed off the criteria that we're using, how important they are, and really given ourselves a chance to objectively evaluate the characteristics, the features of the options. I'm sorry to say, but mostly, even in really important decisions, it's done in a very haphazard and, I would say, half-assed way.
And I suppose we'll get onto this in a later episode. We'll come back to the importance of emotions, and things like impulsivity play a large role in the final options that we end up selecting. We go, oh God, actually just this one. I'm fed up. You reach the end of your tether, or I want to go home now.
Yeah. or you just, it never even, I mean, in a lot of cases, to be fair, and this is not to criticize people, it's just, the culture. In a lot of cases, it doesn't even really occur to someone that you should be doing it in a systematic way. No one does it like that in our organization. Think about political decisions and how they're made. Quite often the civil servants are putting together, very well-informed, detailed impact assessments and evaluations of the different policy options. And the policy makers, the politicians who are making the decisions, are at best paying some attention to it. But when it really comes down to the decision that they make, they're not making that on the basis of a systematic evaluation of that information that's presented to them. Far from it. So, it's the cult. I wouldn't go around sort of blaming people for doing everything in a half-assed way. That's the norm in so many environments.
Right. I see what you're saying, that it's common, and that's why we want to offer some tools to help people. And there's a lot there in what you've said of how we may do things systematically. We've covered some of them in assessing in the previous episodes, and there'll be a lot more going forward. But we are nearing the end of this episode. But before we go, it's important for us to say that at the end of comparing all the decisions, we make a choice and we choose one or more options. And that choice is effectively an intention to do something.
So let's look at this again, sort of trying to think about this as scientifically as we can, which means to think about the specific features of the output of the decision process. So the decision process has a number of features to its output. It's an intention, I'm going to do this, or we are going to do this, or this is going to be done. That intention will have a degree of commitment attached to it. So that's a feature. So it could be that at the end of the decision process, you've decided, well, I'm pretty sure I'm going to do this. This is what I pretty much decided to do, or I'm definitely going to do this. That's no question about it. I'm absolutely going to do this. Or something weaker. It could be, this is a provisional decision. That very often happens. I could do this. I'm not saying I'm definitely going to do it, but I'm kind of there. So recognizing that intentions have a strength of commitment attached to them. That's one thing. The second thing to note is that the output from that intention in relation to a decision process could involve the selection of one option or two options or three options. There may be more than one intention that's formed, one course of action. For example, you might have two posts if you're selecting someone for a job, or three or whatever. So don't always imagine that it's always just going to be one thing. That's the second thing. So you've got commitment, you've got the number of options that you're actually ending up with, you've got timing, and is this intention something that needs to be enacted straight away? Is it something that you can reflect on, give it a day, give it a week or whatever, and then come back to potentially just to make sure? So there's the with that intention, you have to think about this isn't commitment. It's different from that. It's what is the space, the temporal space between having made the decision and the point at which it's got to be enacted. And we're going to talk about enactment next week. So those are some features that we need to, when we're understanding people's decision making and helping people to make decisions, those are some clear, measurable features that we can pay attention to.
It's fascinating, isn't it? The strength of an intention, because that is really key, actually. And it can be quite, what's the word? It can relieve some pressure at the end of a meeting to go, actually, we think we're going in this direction. We'll revisit this, in a few days. And that way you don't have to, it doesn't feel quite so pressured and forced. People have time to think about.
Yeah, and it does relieve the pressure a bit. One word of advice, particularly in group decision making, is that I shouldn't have to say this, but I know from experience that I do, that when a decision is made, it should be recorded.
Yeah.
And reported and written down so that everyone is aware of what the decision was, what the level of commitment was, what the timing was, and what the options were that you ended up deciding about. Because it is so common for everyone to come out of the meeting or the process with a different perspective on this. And even if at the time they understood it, like half an hour later or a week later, they have reconstructed it in their heads. So whatever you do, if it's important, which it usually is, make the secretary, the note taker, whoever it is, should be recording that.
I am nodding vigorously along, and that is something that I completely agree with you. It really seems like that would be obvious, and I've been in meetings where I haven't done it. I'm not sort of always pointing a finger here, but my God, that is very good advice, because in a week's time, you don't remember what has been agreed to, who's going to be doing what, exactly what the action points were and the options. It's good to go back in case you need to revisit earlier bits of the framing, assessing and comparing. But that has been a fantastic podcast. A lot to think about there around comparing. So thank you very much, Robert.
That's a great pleasure. Good to talk to you, Jamie.
Well, yes, it's the only time we talk. Of course it's not. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a nice review if you like it. And links to buy the books are in the description. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Unlocking Behavior Change podcast.